Let's talk about Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal was a 17th century polymath. He was a master of French prose. French prose. Yes. Pascal also contributed to the advance of physics, especially hydraulics. He laid the foundations for the modern theory of probability. He discovered that air gets thinner as we ascend from Earth's surface. And he also invented one of the world's first mechanical computers.
The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite, surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing, in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with a panometric fan. The lineup consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes, so fitted to the ambifacient lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented.
Pascal achieved most of these feats before age 30. He died in 1662 at age 39 while writing a philosophical defense of Christianity that would posthumously be published under the title Pensies. After years of scientific and religious meditations, Pascal lamented the futility of all attempts to rationally demonstrate the truth of religion. He nonetheless remained devoutly religious. It was he who made the famous statement, "The heart hath reasons that reason knows not of." This statement is anatomically inaccurate. The heart is a senseless muscle, not an organ of cognizance. The heart hath no reasons whatsoever. Pascal was, of course, speaking metaphorically, as we would do when we speak of a couch potato. Unfortunately, speaking metaphorically can become a thoroughly nasty habit that obscurantists cannot or will not shake. Metaphor provides a backdoor way of sneaking false statements past our logical doorkeepers. If we translate Pascal's metaphorical utterings into plain English, we find that he was saying,
"If it feels good, believe it."
Of course, as a religious ascetic, Pascal could never admit to doing something just because it felt good. He therefore sought a logical warrant for heeding his pious impulses. He tried to construct a reasonable argument to justify discarding reason, a task that only a lover of paradox would undertake. Paradox. Okay. The colonial patriot Ethan Allen
He's ugly.
voiced the following objection to all attempts to use logic to subvert logic.
Those who invalidate reason ought seriously to consider whether they argue against reason with or without reason. If with reason, then they establish the principle that they are laboring to dethrone. But if they argue without reason, which, in order to be consistent with themselves they must do, they are out of reach of rational conviction, nor do they deserve a rational argument.
Pascal's wager represents an effort to argue against reason with reason. This makes Pascal vulnerable to Ethan Allen's charge that he is establishing the principle he is trying to dethrone. In Pascal's behalf, let me submit that Pascal, while guilty of reasoning, is barely so. Peter Kreeft, in his Pocket Handbook of Christian Apologetics, offered the following paraphrase of Pascal's wager.
If you place your bet with God, you lose nothing, even if it turns out that God does not exist. But if you place it against God, and you are wrong and God does exist, you lose everything.
Pascal and those modern Christians who endorse his argument conveniently overlook the fact that Pascal's wager, if it were a legitimate way to approach belief, would not merely justify believing in one single God. Once you grant yourself permission to believe in a single God contrary to reason, solely on the prospect of some benefit the belief bestows, what's to stop you from believing in a second God, and a third, and as many as you please? You have already dispensed with all rational objections to belief, so all you need to know about any God is whether belief in that God promises some reward. Facts, logic, and all measures of truth are out the window. Now all you care about is the payback. Pascal failed to see this logical extrapolation of his argument. To be fair to Pascal, he did not explicitly say we should believe what is contrary to reason, but he did implicitly argue as much by insisting that when the evidence is ambiguous, we need not suspend judgment as reason demands. We can issue firm declarations even when the evidence doesn't justify them. In other words, what reason dictates is not obligatory if it goes against what one dearly wishes for. This, I hold, is a mistaken principle and a dangerous one. Pascal's next mistake lies in his assertion that if you believe in God and that belief turns out to be wrong, that's not a problem. You have lost nothing. Okay, in some circumstances that might indeed be true. Even a thoroughly false belief might by chance deliver a big payoff. That would be pure happenstance, however, and the odds are probably against a thoroughly false belief having good consequences that outweigh its bad consequences. One inescapable cost of believing something that is false is that you have, at a minimum, lost a piece of the truth. Not a trivial concern for those who actually value truth. There are practical costs as well. If your misplaced belief leads you to behave in a way that you would not otherwise behave, you have misspent part of your life. Economists call this the opportunity cost. I wonder whether Pascal would have argued that nothing is lost by believing that a fleet of guardian angels will provide protection if one should choose to undertake some risky endeavor, like getting drunk and playing catch with a rattlesnake, as was done by the late Joe Buddy Kane of Anniston, Alabama. May he rest in peace. A cost is associated with every false belief, especially a false belief on a topic that really matters. The belief in God is perhaps the prime example of a belief that influences one's behavior, so a wrong belief about the existence of God must rank among life's most expensive mistakes. I sometimes imagine an encounter between Pascal and the terrified children about to be bound and sacrificed to the Incan sun god Inti. Would Pascal have consoled them with his armchair insight that the belief in a non-existent God is risk-free? Pascal's wager operates on the principle that before we judge whether a belief is true or correct, we must determine the consequences of that belief. I don't think Pascal thought this through. Determining the consequences of a belief means determining particular facts. Deciding that something is a fact means deciding that it is true. Yet, by Pascal's own logic, we can't judge any alleged fact as true or false until we trace out its consequences. Pascal's wager thus traps us in a self-referential mire of indecision. This is really quite sad and pathetic. Pascal was wrong to assert that the consequences of our beliefs are pertinent to what we should believe. We should believe what the facts tell us, no more and no less. Suppose a poor man chose to believe he can successfully operate a bulldozer. That belief is certainly not well-founded, but applying Pascal's logic, all the man needs to consider is whether that belief, if true, would have good consequences. In this case, the consequence would likely be that he can earn a respectable income. A good consequence for any poor blind man. According to Pascal's logic, he should believe that it is true that he is an excellent bulldozer operator. He should ignore any contrary evidence, such as the fact that his friends abandon him after he demolishes their homes.
Oh my goodness, and look at this mess. I'm the one who made it, I do confess.
And that later the police arrest him.
You're under arrest.
And he gets beaten and raped in prison. Pascal argued that we should opt for belief in God as a practical strategy, never mind the pertinent facts. But, as the poor incarcerated blind man would surely interject if he had time between rape sessions, no strategy that ignores the facts is ultimately practical. Earnest Christians scorned the notion that we should believe in God as a means to get to heaven, or as fire insurance against hell. Pascal's wager, in their view, applies a cost-benefit calculation more appropriate to business school than Sunday school. Earnest Christians hold that one's belief must be sincere, not contrived for personal advantage. Moreover, to suggest that God could not see through such a charade amounts to blasphemy. This brings us to the most basic fallacy in Pascal's wager, its presumption that we can choose our beliefs. Pascal recommended training ourselves, regulating our thinking through ritual and practice, to deliberately channel and manipulate our beliefs. He's not alone in arguing thusly. William James, father of American psychology, took an even more outlandish approach. In 1896, James published an essay titled The Will to Believe, in which he argued that, even lacking evidence, we can legitimately believe any hypothesis that is live enough to tempt our will. James suggested that if we have heretofore been unwilling or unable to gather enough facts to decide an important issue so that we are left wavering, we can switch our beliefs on or off as we would a lamp. Instead of urging us to gather more information or think harder about our decision, and in the meantime withhold judgment, James encouraged us to flip a mental circuit breaker to energize our belief in the Christian scheme of salvation. James would have us believe as a matter of choice or sheer will rather than as mandated by evidence. I don't know how your mind works, but I myself cannot consciously choose my beliefs. As I read a book about insects, for instance, I can't actually believe that I'm a flea jumping across the page. I can imagine it, I can daydream about it, but owing no doubt to my unshakable sanity, I cannot actually believe whatever I might choose to believe. Even on topics that are not so clear-cut, topics on which my opinion is unsettled, I cannot consciously select what to believe. Suppose that Pascal and James were correct in their claim that it is psychologically possible to consciously manipulate our beliefs to elicit a state of bliss. Embracing the Christian scheme of salvation would be an inefficient way to exercise this faculty. After all, we could instantly secure happiness by choosing to believe that we are already in heaven and skip all the intermediate steps. If our belief that we're in heaven is correct, our bliss will be eternal. If our belief is incorrect, our bliss will last until we die. If, after death, we end up in heaven, our bliss will promptly resume. If we end up in hell, that's no problem. We can just ignore the evidence that we're in hell and continue to believe that we're in heaven. And again, our bliss will last throughout eternity. So even if Pascal and James were correct in thinking that we can switch on our belief in God, they can't rationally justify doing so. I suspect that Pascal's wager is widely accepted across America for 3 reasons. First, it makes a crass appeal to the profit motive. That always works in America. Second, it urges us to take decisive action. Americans pride themselves in taking decisive action. Third, it discourages thinking. Nobody is better at not thinking than Americans. Edwin Wade Till got it right when, in Circle of the Seasons, he remarked,
"It is morally as bad not to care whether a thing is true or not, so long as it makes you feel good, as it is not to care how you got your money so long as you have got it."
As for those philosophers who encourage us to believe as we will, Bertrand Russell offers a similar admonition.
Morally, a philosopher who uses his professional competence for anything except a disinterested search for truth is guilty of a kind of treachery.
Any religious advocate who appeals to Pascal's wager is wearing a thin veneer of logic to coax his unsuspecting target in the direction of irrational superstition, much as a rapist acts superficially polite to coax his victim toward the back alley. When I encounter a fishy line of reasoning, and Pascal's wager is as fishy as they come, I like to try, just for fun, to use the same fishy logic to defend radically different or even diametrically opposed conclusions. I also enjoy reformulating the argument to remove all the logical fallacies, as in the following example. Let's start by supposing that you're pondering the question of God's existence. And after careful reasoning, you decide that you do not believe in God. You believe all gods are fictional. If there is no God, your belief is correct, and you have avoided squandering your life on pointless religious activities, such as attending church and praying and haranguing your co-workers about how pious you are and how worried you are about them getting deep fried in the lake of fire or fricasseed beyond recognition forever and ever. Amen. But what if you are mistaken and there is a God? It turns out that if there is a God, the consequences of your non-belief depend on the nature of God. If God is indifferent to human activities, then, as a product of your non-belief, you again avoid squandering your life on inconsequential, worshipful practices. But suppose God is unjust or sadistic. In that case, as before, you avoid squandering your life trying to please a God who is probably going to fry you anyway. Finally, what if God is just, kind, fair, reasonable, and loving? Well, in that case, you needn't worry that you will be punished for earnestly examining the evidence and arriving at a reasonable, albeit mistaken, conclusion. God is wise and understanding, and all will end well for you. This flowchart shows the possible consequences of atheism, not in false Pascalian terms, but in realistic terms. Still, I do not recommend that anyone adopt beliefs or disbeliefs on the basis of their consequences. One ought to base one's judgment on a careful evaluation of the facts rather than on a what's in it for me calculation. For that reason, I also reject Homer Simpson's version of Pascal's wager. Suppose we've chosen the wrong God. Every time we go to church, we're just making him madder and madder. I also reject Monty Hall's wager, my own application of the Monty Hall dilemma to religious belief. The Monty Hall dilemma is a math puzzle named after the television game show host. In this game, the player is shown 3 doors and told that behind one of the doors is a car, and behind each of the other 2 doors is a goat. To win the car, the player must select the correct door. Suppose you are a contestant playing this game, and you pick door number 2. Then the host opens door number 1, revealing a goat, and asks you whether you want to switch your selection to door 3. Are your odds of winning the car increased by keeping your current selection? Or would you have a higher probability of winning the car if you switched your selection? Or are the odds the same either way? When confronted with this dilemma, I, like most people, presumed that it made no difference. I didn't know which of the 2 closed doors hid the car, so I figured I had a 50-50 chance of winning. That's wrong, but I was so convinced that my logic was correct that I wrote a computer program to demonstrate so. I was surprised to learn that someone who sticks with his original selection wins the car 1/3 of the time, whereas someone who switches his selection wins 2/3 of the time. The explanation as to why this is true would lead us too far off topic. You may wish to research the Monty Hall dilemma on your own. My point in bringing this up is that we can apply the logic of this math puzzle to religion, not in a serious sense, but in a playful sense. Suppose a deep, resonant voice from the clouds informs you,
"One and only one of the 3 Abrahamic religions is true, and you must make a selection."
So you select Christianity. Then the voice from above booms,
"There is no God but me, and Muhammad was not my prophet."
So Islam is off the table. Should you remain a faithful Christian or convert to Judaism? Can you say Shabbat Shalom?
Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom.
Monty Hall's wager is obviously not a proper way to decide which religion to adopt. Yet, Monty Hall's wager is less screwball than Pascal's wager. At least Monty Hall's wager has a statistical argument on its side. Reminiscent of Pascal's wager is the proposition put forward by the theologian John Hick. He says that we're justified in accepting religion, or at least that we're not barred from belief, because the proof of religion will, or may, eventually arrive. Hick trusts that belief will be verified on Judgment Day. This is known as eschatological verification. When I hear this religious argument, I imagine a parallel argument being used in a courtroom. Picture a man appearing in court on rape charges. The prosecuting attorney urges the court to convict the man on the basis of DNA evidence. The judge asks, "Where's the DNA evidence?" The prosecuting attorney replies, "We don't have it yet." "When are you going to have it? This afternoon?" "No, Your Honor, I can't tell you when we will have the evidence. It might arrive any minute or any millennium. But when it does arrive, I'm sure it will prove the defendant's guilt. So we should go ahead and convict him now." In the context of a courtroom, or in any context other than religion, the notion of eschatological verification would never receive a serious hearing. It, like Pascal's wager, reeks of utter desperation. One more point about Pascal's wager. We discussed the fact that we don't have the capacity to switch our beliefs on and off as we would a bedside lamp. In other words, if we perceive that the evidence favors a particular conclusion, we are ineluctably drawn to that conclusion. A Christian apologist who agrees on this point might go on to say that compelling evidence for God's existence would compel us to believe, thereby violating our God-given free will. Therefore, God provides you with no compelling evidence and leaves the decision up to you. For the record, I didn't just make up this argument to make Christian apologists sound dumb. The atheist Eddie Tabash asked the theologian William Lane Craig, "Why can't God give us miracles today so we'd know He exists?" In the course of his reply, Craig suggested that the lack of compelling evidence for God is itself evidence for God who cherishes our free will. There's something ingeniously moronic in an argument that starts with the premise that we can't believe as we will and ends with the conclusion that we are to believe as we will. Such an argument is truly a work of art, really crappy art, a Picasso. A key premise of this argument is that God does not provide compelling evidence for belief. That premise is correct, but if you believe the Bible, it hasn't always been. Jehovah spoke directly to Adam and Eve and walked around in the Garden of Eden. He appeared to Moses and again to Paul on the road to Damascus. He worked miracles in front of tens of thousands of people. He even came back from the dead, exposing his identity to upwards of 500 people. God showed no respect whatsoever for their free will. The argument that God withholds evidence out of respect for human free will fails when applied to ancient times. It is telling that the argument that a lack of evidence counts as evidence is applied only to the modern era, where we confront a conspicuous lack of evidence. This argument, like Pascal's wager, embraces the premise that we lack evidence for a reasonable belief in God. Unfortunately, that premise is the only thing these arguments get right. Given how intellectually vapid and morally abhorrent Pascal's wager is, it's shocking how often it gets deployed in conversations. I was visited not long ago by a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses visit me very often. They must have a list somewhere. This guy right here, he's worth 30 points. For 35 points, you get the refrigerator freezer. No, I'm sure it doesn't work like that. Anyway, I heard them marching toward my front door. And I wondered what I should do. No, absolutely not. That's no way to deal with human beings. I've heard some folks advocate spraying them with a water hose, but that's disgraceful behavior, so I opened the door. They were standing there smiling really big.
Let's talk about Jesus, the King of Kings is He.
No, I can't be bothered with that. I have no time for that sort of nonsense.
No, I'm kidding. I have always been gracious to Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm like, come on in, have a seat. Would you like a glass of iced tea, a foot massage, a rim job? I'm happy to have you here, Thanks for dropping by.
Thank you so much for having me.
But I do find it annoying that Jehovah's Witnesses, or other believers, Christians and Muslims, continually bring up Pascal's wager. They don't even know that this particular folly has a name. So, in the future, if you encounter anyone who whips out Pascal's wager on you, tell them the name of their folly. If we label it often enough, people may eventually become aware. Well, thank you for watching this video. I want to give an especially warm thank you to those readers who have taken the time to probe the inner sanctum of my book, Religion Refuted. Oh, and if this video hasn't convinced you that Pascal's wager is unsound, then let me suggest that it is possible, and I'm not saying probable, but possible, that anyone who reads my book is automatically admitted into heaven. So if you read Religion Refuted, and doing so gets you into heaven, then you win. If you read Religion Refuted, and it doesn't get you into heaven, it's still worth it.
Religion Refuted.